Hey everyone, so last week John presented a detailed analysis of the stunning Red Dead Redemption 2 with a tech-focused video at full 4K presenting the game running at its best on Xbox One X alongside a second piece, a platform analysis comparing all console versions of the game. There are a couple of threads left dangling, however, aspects of the game the community has asked us to take a look at. Our focus with the enhanced consoles was on their 4K capabilities, and to be fair, that has been the emphasis in the marketing as well. But what about users running 1080p displays with their Xbox One X or PS4 Pro consoles? What's the score there? We also didn't have much time to look at the game's HDR support. It looked good in places, but something wasn't quite right. We took a long time and did a lot of analysis work there to figure out what's actually going on, and we'll be covering this in the video later. But first up, 1080p, Full HD. Well, with Xbox One X, Red Dead Redemption 2 operates in exactly the same way as any other game. The higher resolution frame buffer, native 4K in this case, is downsampled to 1080p, giving an extra boost to image quality there. Now, Microsoft's clever approach to supporting sub 4K displays is really simple actually. They just don't tell the developer what screen is attached to the console, meaning that any display mode variations, performance modes, quality modes, they all need to be in the menu system where the user can freely choose between them. PlayStation 4 Pro though, this is different, and this is where things start to get interesting. Developers do know whether a 1080p or 4K screen is attached and can create specific modes for each. From my perspective, it's a bit annoying that this can happen without any visibility being given to the user, but it is what it is. And yes, Red Dead 2 does have different modes for 1080p and Ultra HD displays. Thus far, we've just looked at the game running in its 4K mode, where you get what appears to be a reconstructed 3840 by 2160 resolution, which breaks down somewhat in motion and resolves more to a blurry 1920 by 2160 output. However, if your Pro is at default settings and attached to a 1080p screen, you do actually get a native 1080p image. Yup, 1920 by 1080, and half the pixel count of the Pro's 4K output mode. There are advantages to limiting the resolution like this, but thanks to the recent super sampling option added to the PS4 system software, you can push for an SSAA effect if that's what you want. Just pop into the appropriate menu, engage the mode, and the game will act as though it's attached to a 4K screen, but it will obviously downscale that to 1080p. So why isn't Red Dead doing that anyway? I mean, surely more pixels being rendered is pretty much always a good thing. Well, I'd say there are actually plus and minus points in this case. First of all, let's consider the scaling situation. On Xbox One X, you have a native 4K frame buffer, and that downscales to 1080p. Simple. However, on PS4 Pro, it's 1920 by 2160, and then you have the reconstruction, which doesn't always look great, and then you have downscaling. When you start scaling an image more than once, things start to look a little blurry, and that's exactly what you see here in Red Dead Redemption 2. Stacked up side by side with the native 1080p image, there is an argument that a one-to-one pixel map to the display resolution will present a cleaner, sharper image in this case. But there clearly are some advantages to using super sampling in Red Dead 2 on the Pro, even if the double scaling situation isn't optimal. The temporal anti-aliasing solution in the game clearly has some issues processing transparencies, most noticeably on hair, where you get this somewhat dithered looking effect. It's one of the few visual blemishes in this particular game, and you can see here in close-up that the effect is improved and looking, well, not too bad actually, if you use the Pro's super sampling option. Clearly though, running the game at 1080p means a massive drop in the game's GPU requirement, which means that, in theory at least, we might hope to see an end to the small performance drops in the game, and yeah, that's exactly what you get. Now, one thing I think we really need to stress before going on here is that whether you run at 1080p or 4K, PS4 Pro's performance profile in Red Dead 2 isn't bad at all. and both modes offer a clear advantage over the base machine. Yes, there are some drops from the target frame rate in 4K mode, but the vast bulk of the experience plays out at 30 frames per second. When you're out in the wilderness, for example, frame rate barely moves at all from the target, and that's actually the case on all of the platforms. It's only when we move into populous areas like Valentine or Saint Denis that we start to see some dropped frames. Our emphasis here is on the PS4 Pro, and you can see that even in 4K mode, while the graph isn't flat, the performance drop is hardly dramatic, and in places you are seeing a big boost over the standard PlayStation 4. But as you would hope, running the game at 1080p native on the Pro basically sorts out all of the outstanding issues. Now let's take a look at a three-way comparison head-to-head here. Both flavours of the Pro, along with the Xbox One X. Out in the wilderness there's parity anyway effectively, and this is mostly representative of the vast majority of gameplay. However, here in Valentine, Pro at 4K does start to introduce some drop frames. Pro at 1080p though, the flat line there on the graph as expected. Moving into Saint Denis, here's the same thing again, a total lock on the Pro at 1080p native, where the 4K mode can have some small performance issues and where even the Xbox One X can drop isolated frames. We can give that version a pass since it is operating at full 4K throughout, a full 4 times the resolution of the Pro's native 1080p mode, which offers equivalent and slightly better performance. But there we are, it's conclusively proven that A, Pro can deliver 1080p if you want it, while super sampling remains an option at the system level, and B, the small frame rate blemishes Pro does have are sorted with the native 1080p mode. I guess really and truly the best comparison for PlayStation owners is this: base versus Pro at native 1080p. The Pro simply delivers the horsepower to totally iron out the performance problems completely, if that's how you prefer to use the extra GPU capabilities of the hardware. Which is the best mode for 1080p users though? Well, Rockstar obviously prefers native 1080p for 1080p screens, or it would never have been created. Personally, I still hope to see the developer return to the 4K implementation on Pro and push for a reconstruction solution that matches the best the industry has to offer. The talent is there, the resources are there, and I still feel it should have been implemented on day one. After all, the Pro's 2 years old now basically. 4K reconstruction can, has, and should look a lot better. Okay, so now let's move on to another area that's been a little problematic for us, the HDR support. Now, I think there are times when HDR looks okay in Red Dead 2, but not spectacular, and I think these moments are simply because the existing SDR tone mapping solution for normal screens is already rather decent. You get flashes of this at the beginning of the game, where a dark room with a snowy exterior could be a clipped nightmare, but it still manages to hold up pretty well. Then there's some of the light bleed you see on interiors here. I saw effects like this in the trailer and thought that we could have a potentially world-class HDR solution on our hands here once we got to see the code running on our displays. But well, something's off. Okay, so we've not been able to demonstrate HDR in our videos to anyone other than the select amount of users who can watch our HDR content. But on the Reset Era forum, a user going by the name of Evil Boris, who did work with us on this analysis, created this amazing visualization technique. We're going to showcase Assassin's Creed Odyssey here as an example of a great HDR implementation. So what's happening right now is that you're seeing a tone-mapped SDR version of this sequence, but HDR, it's all about the brightness, expanding the dynamic range. A 100 nits image in SDR can be anything up to 4000 nits in HDR in this case, and Evil Boris's technique maps brightness to color. By using the inset scale here, you can get an idea of just how bright and vibrant the image can be. Content that sits in the 100 nit range and under is rendered in monochrome, and this is kind of like the SDR range if you like, while the imagery that breaks this boundary is mapped to the color range you see at the base of the screen there. And in the case of Odyssey, it can be so bright that even the best HDR TVs need to tone map it down to their limits, which is typically in the 1000 to 1500 nit range. But here's Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, we've checked this on both Xbox One and PlayStation 4, and it's the same. Peak brightness at the maximum setting cannot exceed 500 nits. Check out the calibration screen here, and what you may notice is that the on-screen variable there actually maps directly to peak brightness. And that's where the next mystery begins. You see, the game actually recommends LCD users to lock to a value of 100, which means 100 nits, which means, well, an SDR image in an HDR container. 300 is the recommended setting for OLED screens, where some games in HDR do present a little dimly, but the bottom line is that expanding the peak brightness via the slider does not really expand the dynamic range at all. We're looking at an 8-bit image remapped into a 10-bit space, so you're not actually getting any extra detail here. It also means that there's very little nuance in the image. Now, earlier I showed how the SDR tone map could produce some good results, and that's good by SDR standards, but not great at all compared to what is possible with HDR. Peak brightness is instead locked to the whitest element of the SDR presentation, which is essentially the HUD. And if that's the brightest aspect of the presentation, the fact that it's on screen so often could even have potential burn-in issues for your screen if you ramp up the in-game brightness too high. All told then, there's not much, if anything, to gain by using Red Dead 2's HDR mode, and potentially there are some downsides. It's all going to be a matter of personal taste and what looks good to you really, but I'm just not really sure what the point of this is right now. I mean, let's go back again and look at Assassin's Creed Odyssey. There's actual range there, real depth, you can see it in the visualization there, a marriage of the internal HDR pipeline with the final HDR output, plus a state-of-the-art calibration system to boot. Red Dead 2 is at the technical pinnacle in so many ways. It's just the HDR implementation and the PS4 Pro reconstruction aspects that fall a little short, and I really do hope that Rockstar can address this. Okay, so hopefully that covers off some of the remaining questions about the technical makeup of Red Dead Redemption 2. As always, please do like and subscribe to support the kind of work we do here at Digital Foundry. And yes, please do consider our Patreon for supporting the team more directly and getting pristine quality video downloads into the bargain. But that's all from me for now. As always, thanks for watching.